Today I'll be discussing White Sargasso Sea, a book by the British Dominican author Rhys. She published the book in the late 60s when the second wave of feminism was in full force. She published it in 1966 when she was 74, nearly 75, and had suffered a heart attack just before submitting the manuscript. Thankfully, she was able to live in relative comfort off of the sales of her book. But now that we come to the topic, White Sargasso Sea, it is a reimagining of sorts of the very famous book by Charlotte Bronte, Jane Eyre. Now, I would say it is a prequel to one of the most enigmatic, mysterious, polarizing characters in Jane Eyre, Edward Rochester's first wife, Bertha Antoinette Mason. But for the course of this video, we'll be addressing her by the name Rhys gave her, Antoinette Causeway. So this book, it is set in the Caribbean in a hot tropical climate, just to emphasize the difference between Bertha and her husband Rochester, who is from England, which is cool and fair and has a history steeped in colonialism and, atrocities, tragedies. So now that we come to it, the first thing I would like to discuss about the book is how neatly it parallels Jane Eyre itself, the source material. Now, on the surface, when I first read the book, I was struck by the fact that it didn't seem to draw upon the source material very much. Of course, the backstory remained the same for both Bertha and for Edward, but you didn't see those mentions of the book that it was, that it came from. A lot of mentions. It took a life of its own. So I was then on closer reading, I found that the childhood experiences of both Bertha, or as I promised, Antoinette and Jane, are very similar. Both have very troubled, very secluded childhoods, where they are neglected by their primary caretakers, largely left to their own devices. They are educated and fostered in a religious institution, but they are very different in how their outlook on religion. While Bertha is more cynical, more jaded, more irreligious, so to speak, but still has her superstitions, has her belief in the magic, the myth, mythic stories. Jane is more devout, is very Christian, very noble, and very, fair-minded, very righteous even, you could say, and has a lot of integrity and principle. Also, I feel the book is divided into three primary sections. The first would be part 1, which is all about Bertha or Antoinette's childhood and her relationship with her mother and her mentally abnormal brother. So, her so as you would know if you read the source material, Bertha's mother is very infamously mad. And that is where Bertha is said to have inherited this madness. But it's shown that Bertha is the child of former slave owners. And while that is again, a very sensitive, very delicate subject, it is handled with much care and with justice. So after, of course, the slave, just to give you a little bit of a historical context, after the Slave Abolition Act was passed, Bertha and her family lost all their estates. So they lived in dire poverty, in a ramshackle estate, run-down estate, where the nobles, the upper class, looked down on them, and the former slaves looked upon them with resentment and bitterness and anger, and they felt that their reduced circumstances were only just, considering how intolerant and cruel and they had been before. So this is shown to be in a very, I think, as I said, balanced and very balanced manner, the treatment of this whole subject. And how Bertha's mother feels about it, especially because she was very young when she married Bertha's much older father. And as a young woman, her husband died young. She was left a very young widow with with two children and a son who needed much care and attention because of his deficiencies. So this developed in her in a very she was very volatile, so to speak, very um, temperamental, even had her passions and her excesses, but she isn't explicitly mad. She goes mad for very, you could say, legitimate reasons, valid reasons, because after her second marriage to a different man who promises her a better life, a more secure, a more comfortable life, something that I would like to note again is echoed in Bertha's own marriage to Rochester, that they both marry men who promise them better lives, safer lives, more comfortable lives, lives lived in safety and not with any fear or hardship or poverty or adversity, a lot of which they had suffered in their lives. So, but her dreams are sadly, shattered. She is very mistaken in the person that she does marry, and because he doesn't really trust her. She has lived in the Caribbean. She knows how the people there are, how they look upon her children, upon her family with distrust. And her husband's grand, very lavish spending earns the bitterness and the reprisal of the former slaves, and they set fire to her estate, in the process killing her young son. So she goes mad also, and she is left in the care of two people who torment her endlessly. So this is some context on Bertha's mother, who is a very central figure in both Jane Eyre and in White Sargasso Sea. The book is also divided into two other sections. As I said, part 3, the last section, is the shortest section, and part 2 deals with Bertha's marriage to Rochester. So I was struck again. I use the word a lot, but what really struck me about the book was how it was littered with mentions of disease and rot and dirtiness and dust and filth. How at times the writing was very cramped, very narrow, very crowded, even to better invoke this image of this hot, damp, warm climate. This so the two Bertha and Rochester's marriage, as you'd see, it's very fraught, very troubled, and as you would surmise. But in initial days, they find some common ground. While Bertha is mistress of her estate, and she very liberally, very generously shares with Rochester, she still has the command of her servants. They listen to her. They listen to her. They follow her command. Generally, she is the mistress. Rochester feels emasculated by this. He feels as though he is, because he very untraditionally, he travels to his bride and he settles down in her place, in her homeland, in her her domain, so to speak. So he goes there, unlike how marriages usually are, where the woman goes to her husband's house and has to learn to adapt. So he finds the climate very unfamiliar, very alien, hostile to him. Very, for some reason, very foreign, very alien, very unlike where he was from. From cold, calm England. England that made sense, logical England. So he's shown to be very cold and has, a lot of greed. Though he, tries to convince himself and the readers that he is principled and that he has some, moral compunctions and everything. But Bertha's part, I felt, was dealt with. She was a more distant character in the second part, at least to me. She was more aloof from the reader. She seemed, on the precipice of some on the brink of, something of this, of some madness, some drastic action. And how she dealt with her marriage, the breakdown of her marriage, I found very moving, because that is when Bertha drew nearer to me as a reader, that is where she became flesh and blood again. While her initial days, how Rochester views her, it is very interesting, because when I read the first part of the book, she is this young child, young girl, lonely, vulnerable, imaginative, restless, vivacious even sometimes, at times, but and bolder, freer than I think Jane Eyre is. As Rochester views her as this very coy, very delicate, very fragile, volatile, unhappy woman, as this woman who is very prone to madness and is too believing, too trusting of her servants, who is irrational, illogical, doesn't really calculate very well on things, and how she trusts her money too freely. This is again a clue to Rochester's own greed, because he is amazed at how free she is with her money, how liberal, how open with her trust, with her money, with her food, with everything. So I found that, yes, it was very interesting to see how these two personalities work together, how they clash horribly, and how ultimately Rochester takes her back to England. Because though what Rochester's part, his narrative in the story, because he is given this narrative, would have you believe that it is Bertha who has all the agency, the power, the control, who is, has destroyed his life, ruined it utterly, and who has deceived him, tricked him, duped him into this marriage. But ultimately, you see that he could drag Bertha back to England with him and lock her up in the attic, get her diagnosed with madness. So yes, it is a very moving, tragic story, a doomed story. I enjoyed how the ending shows how Bertha liberates herself, frees herself of Rochester's tyranny, his cruelty, by setting fire to Thornfield, and which costs her her own life. I would strongly recommend you read it. Until next time.